lecture is over Chapter 4, Cognition. When we talk about cognition, the first thing we have to talk about is cognitive styles. And what cognitive styles are, is they are one's preferred way of processing information as well as dealing with tasks. And they serve as ways of being able to organize and use the cognitive information that we get. And this allows a cultural group and its members to then deal effectively with problems that are encountered in their daily living. Because we are talking about a cultural group here, everyone's cognitive style is going to be different. The first cognitive style is sensation. When we talk about sensation, what we are basically talking about is the process by which receptor cells are stimulated and then they transmit their information to various brain centers. Now, when you see a moving bright light in the evening sky, or think about if you taste a spicy pickle in your mouth, all of these are sensations, and all of them begin from a signal or a stimulus, either external or internal, and it's always in the form of energy that's capable of exciting that nervous system. With sensation, there are two different thresholds. We have the absolute threshold and the difference threshold. Our absolute threshold, this is the minimum amount of physical energy needed for an individual to notice a stimulus. So the minimum amount of sound that we need to come out of a radio in order for us to be able to notice that sound is coming out of the radio. Then there's the difference threshold. This is the lowest level of stimulation that's required to sense that a change in the stimulation has occurred. So think about if you were turning your radio up. A lot of times when you go from, let's say, volume number 2 to volume number 3, you don't sense that a change has occurred. However, if you go from volume 2 to maybe volume 5, then you are finally able to sense that a change has occurred. Now, what we're looking for in the difference threshold is that lowest level of stimulation required to then sense that there was a change. And then finally, sensation has what we call sensory adaptation. And this is the tendency of the sensory system to respond less to a stimuli that continues without change. So think of us and how we can adapt as humans. So we can adapt, for example, to particular conditions such as hot or cold, air pollution, spicy foods. So let's use the example of air pollution. So with sensory adaptation, residents of a small resort town in Spain, they are less likely to attend to the air they breathe. They're less likely to think about it. But a tourist that's visiting this small resort town in Spain that maybe comes from a more polluted city like Mexico City or Los Angeles, they are very likely to notice that incredible freshness of the air. So think kind of about the 5 senses and think about all of the things that you've previously learned about them. And then think about, are they different in different cultures? Or do all of our brains work the same? What about our experiences? Could our experiences affect how we experience sensation? Well, absolutely. But are those experiences necessarily a cultural experience or just an individual personal experience? So this is something that really can't be answered. It's going to kind of be left up to the individual. Along with sensation, we also have to talk about perception. And this is because this is the process that then organizes all of our various sensations into meaningful patterns. So think of 3 colored vertical stripes, blue, white, and red. And it's going to be displayed in that same sequence on a piece of material. This is going to have little meaning for a boy from Bangladesh or Northern Ireland. However, for a French adult, this sequence of colors is associated with the French national flag. Even if you take the sequence out and just perceive the colors, now it could have meaning for a United States adult because our flag, our colors of our nation are also red, white, and blue. Now, physiologists, they assert that perception involves the activation of association areas in our cortex, and that we then integrate prior knowledge along with the current sensation. So now, all of those questions I asked you on the previous slide, what about now? Do our perceptions decide how we perceive different sensations? So now, is this affected by our culture? Or again, is this affected by individual experiences? Well, there are certain things where culture influences what we do perceive. Now, personal experience is going to influence most people's sensation and perception and is probably going to take culture out of it. But culture will influence some things that we perceive. So think of if many individuals from a particular group were to share experiences, there's going to be a common group-related sensory or perceptual pattern. And what this means is those that are members of the same group, those that are members of the same culture, they're going to have that common group-related sensory. Perception of time is definitely a perception that influences what we perceive. So it's long been accepted or suggested that Westerners tend to define punctuality using precise measures of time. So we tend to, when we're talking about time, say, I will be there in 1 minute, 15 minutes, an hour. And that's how we talk about time. But in other more traditional cultures, time is actually measured by significantly longer intervals, and those intervals are not usually using a precise measure of time. So if you talk to several people who have either traveled or lived abroad, they can tell you how people in different cultures perceive and treat time guidelines. So there was someone from the Caribbean that jokingly said one time that in his island, people are generally not in a hurry compared to visitors from the United States. So that just shows the difference in the perception of time, and that's kind of based on culture because it's based on nationality, which it makes up a portion of our culture. We also are going to have environmental conditions that are going to affect sensation and perception. So an example of this is that hunter and gatherer cultures have a lower rate of color blindness among their members than societies that practice more agriculture. So from an evolutionary standpoint, basically, colorblind hunters would not be able to survive as they need that ability to distinguish details, colors, contours. People who live in deserts, they do not technically suffer the hearing loss that to an extent that city dwellers do. So now think about all of these influences. Do we consider these environmental conditions to be cultural influences, or are they just environmental influences? What about how we perceive pictures? Do we perceive pictures based on our culture? Well, in a classical study that was done, and this was conducted among the Mekin, which is a remote group in Ethiopia, who happened to have some limited access to formal schooling, little exposure to pictures, but basically scientists used detailed drawings of animals. And they gave them to this group, to these people that have this formal, this limited access to the formal schooling. And what they found was that with few exceptions, the subjects were able to identify the animals, but only after some time and with some obvious mental effort. So this leads us to that our perception, especially with pictures, is linked to our educational and our socialization experience, or the lack thereof it. The other thing that's been found when we perceive pictures is that there is evidence that scanning patterns and how we look at a picture are subject to some cultural variations. So these variations include a very significant finding. And what this finding is that the direction that we examine pictures is linked to our reading habits. So, for example, it's expected that someone from England, Argentina, Canada, somebody who reads from left to right, is going to have a left to right scanning pattern when they look at a picture. Now, Arab and Hebrew readers, they read from right to left. So they're going to demonstrate a right to left scanning pattern when they look at a picture. And then finally, Japanese readers who read from top to bottom, they're going to have a top to bottom pattern in terms of picture scanning. So culture is definitely going to play a part in how we're going to perceive pictures. There's also cultural variation in visual illusions as well as our perception of depth. So our depth perception is going to refer to the organization of sensations in 3 dimensions. And this happens even though our image on the eye's retina is actually only 2-dimensional. Now, along with this depth perception, there's going to be those cultural variations then in how we perceive these visual illusions. So these 2-dimensional pictures that look 3-dimensional to us. So with regard to our ability to see these illusions, the differences in the visual perception may also be influenced by the different experiences of the members of these groups. So when you have a minute, take a look at the figures in your book, which are on page 111. And these are all some famous visual illusions. And maybe get together with somebody else, your roommate, family member, and see if how you perceive them is the same. Because a lot of times, the cultural variation in how we perceive these visual illusions is based on the experiences of the members of certain groups. When we talk about perception of color, we have to talk about exactly what color is. So color has 3 universal psychological dimensions. We have hue, which is basically what people mean by color. Brightness, which refers to the color's intensity. And then saturation, which indicates the color's purity. Now, some studies stress the physiological differences among racial groups in terms of their color perception. So, according to some language-related theories of color perception, which emphasize the role of language in the identification and labeling of colors, there are some words that are linked to various units of the visible spectrum. However, all of those words don't necessarily translate into every language. So that leads us to the subjective, social, and individual psychological meaning of color, and that can be crucial to our understanding of color perception as well. So there was a study that was done that looked at color preference, and it showed that women across countries tend to choose and like reddish hues, such as pink. Now, on the other hand, men had a preference for a greenish blue color. So what happened was the researchers suggested that the differences in color preference may actually be connected to the evolutionary ability of the female brain to deal with the gathering of food in the garden, which is going to be a lot of different colors. But if you think about it, the green are the colors of the leaves. So we're actually looking for different colors for the vegetables. And then the men's brains, they tend to be wired to be better hunters in those green and lush environments with the green grass and the blue sky. Now, some other color interpretations. In many nations, red is considered a political symbol of violence, revolution, and revolt. In communist China and the Soviet Union, government officials had made red banners the official flags of their countries. The official flag of Nazi Germany in 1930 and the 40s was also red. However, in Japan, red actually stands for philanthropy and vitality. And that red circle on their national flag, it represents the sun. So this shows how our culture, our nationality changes how we perceive certain colors. Another interesting set of facts, and this is from your book, that's related to human perception is the perception of the colors black and white. So more than 2 decades ago, researchers found that preschool children in the United States from various racial groups, so various, we took from lots of different racial groups, they all tended to prefer light to dark-skinned people on pictures and photographs, and they favored the color white over the color black. Now, this was regardless of their various racial groups. Now, they did the same research of African children, all children that were black, and they actually shared the exact same color bias. So why do you think this is? Do you think it's because we tend to look at white is good and black is bad in terms of color preference, not in terms of racial preference? I'm talking about actual color. So think about, angels. We tend to put nice angels in white, bad angels in black. Think of the movie The Black Swan. The good swan was in white. The bad swan was black. So is that why we perceive these color differences? Is it always like this? Why do you think it is? So just something to kind of think about in terms of our perception of color. Perceptions for our other senses. With hearing, most of our variations in hearing are based on individual physiological differences. And these differences are usually related to age, education, professional training, environmental conditions, and general experience. However, there can be a small cultural variation, especially when we get into where a person lives. So we go back to that example I had where somebody in the desert isn't going to experience the hearing loss that somebody would that lives in a city. With taste, regardless of our background, regardless of our culture, we all have 4 basic tastes. We actually have 5, but the 4 different basic tastes that are always brought up are the sweet, the sour, the bitter, the salty. Our 5th basic taste is umami, which is savory. But regardless of who we are, regardless of where we come from, regardless of our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, it doesn't matter. We all have these basic tastes. And so this is going to vary very insignificantly in terms of detecting those primary tastes. Now, with smell, this is going to be varied according to culture. So across time and cultures, people tend to associate pleasant odors with high moral values. And the presence of a pleasant odor was associated more with high class and high power. And then finally, touch and pain. Touch and pain is not going to be culturally different. The sense of touch, it's a combination of at least 3 qualities: pressure, temperature, and pain. And that's going to be exactly the same in all cultures, and the only way it's going to vary is in individuals. Now, along with all of these perceptions, we also have to look at consciousness and culture. So when we do this, culture is kind of an inseparable attribute of human consciousness. And what consciousness is it's our subjective awareness of our own sensations, our own perceptions, and any other mental events that we have. So it is a process that has several stages or several states, and the normal flow of consciousness may actually consist of periods of full attention, full concentration, or even relative detachment from outside events. And that consciousness is going to direct our human behavior in ways that are adaptive, in particular to physical and social environments. Now, when we talk about this, people tend to focus on things that are important more for survival or for the accomplishment of a specific goal in terms of consciousness. So, a motorist in New York, somebody who drives a car in New York City, is definitely going to pay attention to traffic reports that are on the car radio. But a guest from South Africa may not attend to them at all while walking down 7th Avenue. So that's where how consciousness is going to play a part in terms of that cultural. We also have some cultural significance when it comes to sleep and dreams. So at this exact moment, about a third of the world population is sleeping. And what this means is that at any moment in time, in the 24 hours, a third of the population is sleeping. Now, when we talk about sleep, what we're talking about is it is a non-waking state of consciousness that's characterized by general unresponsiveness to the environment, as well as general physical immobility. Now, in addition, during sleep, responsiveness to external and particularly visual stimulation is completely diminished, but it's not entirely absent. And there are definitely tremendous variations in how wakeful we are when sleeping. Now, in addition to that, the cultural practices, the sleeping arrangements, general environmental conditions, all of this can influence a person's responsiveness to that external stimulation during sleep. There's also going to be significant individual variations in terms of the duration of sleep. And this duration of sleep may also vary from culture to culture. So a study of the sleep-wakefulness cycle of adults found that the average duration of sleep in Mexican subjects was longer than in other Western countries. Now, obviously, a lot of things are going to play a part in a sleep-wakefulness cycle other than culture, but as a whole, certain cultures definitely have a longer sleep duration versus a shorter sleep duration. What about dreams? So with our dreams, these are going to be story-like sequences of images that occur during sleep. And there has been a distinction between two types of cultures in terms of how the interpretation of dreams was found. So the first is monophasic cultures. And these are cultures that are typically associated with a materialist worldview. So think of this is going to be very much the Western world. They value the cognitive experiences that take place only during the waking phases, and they do not really incorporate dreams into the process of social perception or social cognition. And instead, dreams are regarded as kind of an indirect indication of a dreamer's concern, maybe their fears or desires. Now, in polyphasic cultures, which are cultures that are associated with more of a spiritual or traditional view, they actually value dreams and they treat them as part of their reality. So, what can we infer about the cultural differences in the content of people's dreams? And think about, are they significant? The other thing is, do they relate to altered states of consciousness? So when we're talking about altered states of consciousness, this is our general name for the phenomena that's different from normal waking consciousness, but would include a mystic, perpetual, or sensory experience. So think of meditation, hypnosis, trance, or possession. Now, under the influences of the Protestant tradition, or in Western Europe, ASC, altered states of consciousness, are considered mostly as kind of an abnormal phenomenon that's linked in some cases to mental illness. However, ASC is widely reported across the globe. So that leads us to two of the most important, which are the trance and the meditation. So our trance, this is going to be our sleep-like state that's going to be marked by a reduced sensitivity to stimuli, the loss or alteration of knowledge, and automatic motor activity. Now, some people think of trance in terms of daydreaming, and that can absolutely be thought of that way. But when you talk about trance in other cultures, it's not the same as what we think of here in the United States or in the Western world as daydreaming. But if you think about daydreaming, you have that reduced sensitivity to stimuli. You might have the loss or alteration of knowledge. That automatic motor activity might go away because you are daydreaming. You're staring off into space. You don't know anything about what's going on around you. Now, when we talk about trances, they're usually induced by external sources. These can be music, singing, direct suggestion from other people. And they may provide kind of a, how would I put this? Kind of a sense of protection, maybe even a sense of wisdom or greatness. And so what happens is there's a difference that comes on between a visionary trance when a person is experiencing hallucinations, the sleep-like state trance that we've been talking about, and then even a possession trance, which is when a person reports that his body has been invaded or captured by a spirit. Now, trance-like and possession experiences, these are described as parts of a religious practice in many cultures. And according to one survey that was done from your book, visionary or possession trance states were reported in 90% of the countries in a large world sample. Now, we also have meditation. Meditation is a quiet or relaxed state of tranquility in which a person achieves an integration of thoughts, perceptions, attitudes. And usually, this state is attained with the cooperation of a special principle or a special belief. And people who meditate, they often describe their experiences as to kind of leading to liberation from the self or even an expansion of their conscious awareness. So in Buddhism, for example, it's believed that meditation leads to more of a deepened and clearer understanding of the reality that is happening around them. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on cognition. If there's any questions, please reach out to me.